Most of the naval clashes in World War II in the Pacific were between USA and Japan. But in April 1942, the Japanese sent a task force into the Indian Ocean. This resulted in the only fleet-sized clash between the Japanese Imperial Navy and Britain's Royal Navy that occurred throughout the entire war. A few Australian and Dutch units were present, but no American forces were involved at all. It was a fascinating clash between two divergent traditions and theories of war at sea, both of which were perfectly valid in their own circumstances. Both strategically and tactically, the result appeared to be clearly decisive, and yet curiously it turned out not to be so, for the victors did not capitalise on their successes. The main result was a reappraisal of policy in the area by the losers. This is the story of what happened. By the spring of 1942, Japanese imperial ambitions in the Pacific had been exceeded beyond all expectations, far ahead of schedule and with minimal casualties. The European colonial powers were preoccupied with war at home. Their policy of defending their Far Eastern possessions with large forces using mostly obsolete equipment had proven to be disastrously inadequate. The American Air Force had been effectively eliminated by surprise attacks on the Philippines. The American fleet had been similarly disabled at Pearl Harbor. Luck alone had saved the aircraft carriers, which had been out of harbour when the attack came. It was these carriers that were ultimately to claim the credit for stemming the seemingly irresistible tide of the Japanese advances, which soon overran the Philippines, Malaya and Dutch East Indies. In 1942, although the benefits and advantages of naval aviation were recognised by all the combatants, most authorities still saw the battleship as the main naval strike weapon, not, as it was to prove, merely extra defensive firepower for carrier task forces, or provider of heavy support for amphibious landings. All of the American Pacific Fleet battleships had been destroyed or immobilised at Pearl Harbor. Both of Britain's immediately available capital units, Prince of Wales and Repulse of the ill-starred Force Z, had been sunk attempting to defend Singapore. To conventional strategic thought, the Japanese had the run of the Western Pacific, helped by their interior lines of communication. Even to those who foresaw the domination of the aircraft carrier, the situation still seemed grave, for the Japanese had 6 big fleet carriers to the Americans' 4, and they also had several small escort carriers as well. It must have seemed that nothing could stop this Oriental blitzkrieg. Japanese superiority was so absolute in the Pacific that threats to adjacent areas became a real possibility. With the fall of Singapore on February 15, 1942, and Rangoon on March 28th, the British in particular became alarmed at the prospect of a descent upon the jewel of the empire, the subcontinent of India itself. The perceived threat was to the island of Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. A substantial Japanese fleet based there would dominate the whole of the Indian Ocean, effectively severing the sea routes to India, Australia and the valuable Middle Eastern oil fields. For their part, the Japanese were rather at a loose end as to what to do with their premier strike force. An invasion of Hawaii had been rejected due to the distance. Consultation with the Germans had been made with regard to a tentative link-up between the Afrika Korps and a Japanese force invading through the Middle East via Ceylon and South India. This plan, which epitomised British fears, was eventually vetoed by Hitler. The only remaining option was to push south onto Australia, a move that was to eventually lead to the strategic check at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Before they moved, though, the Japanese decided to sweep into the Indian Ocean to dispose of the remaining British Commonwealth naval presence. Accordingly, every possible resource was scraped together to defend Ceylon. The garrison of the island was strengthened until by the end of March it was the equivalent of 2 whole divisions. The anti-aircraft defences were upgraded and reorganised. Radar was earmarked for installation at the Ceylon air bases, and 2 satellite fields constructed to accommodate no less than 6 extra squadrons of fighters flown in to provide air cover. Finally, an Eastern Fleet was formed, under the command of one of Britain's top admirals, Sir James Somerville, and based at the excellent natural harbour at Trincomalee and a secret base under construction at the Adu Atoll. By the 25th of March, this fleet consisted of 5 battleships, 3 aircraft carriers, 7 cruisers, 16 destroyers, 3 submarines, a monitor, and numerous support ships, escorts, sloops, and other auxiliaries. It was an impressive build-up in such a short period of time, especially considering the desperate demands of other theatres of operation, and it underlined the importance Britain placed on retaining control of the area. On paper, this British concentration seems impressive, but close examination soon begins to show serious deficiencies. The principal weakness of the Eastern Fleet was its ad hoc nature. Most of the ships had been drawn together from several different commands and then never operated together before. The 16 destroyers alone were of 12 different classes. Nor did the actual vessels themselves inspire a great deal of confidence. Of the 5 battleships, the 4 R-class types, making up the 3rd Battle Squadron, had all been built before the First World War. They were slow, they were short-ranged, and being designed before the advent of effective air power, they had very little deck armour, making them very vulnerable to dive bomber attacks. The 5th battleship, Warspite, was also a veteran of the 1914-1918 conflict, but at least she had since been extensively modernised, with improved anti-aircraft guns and thicker deck armour. She'd been completely re-engined, making her nearly 5 knots faster, and she'd been fitted with radar. Of the aircraft carriers, Hms Hermes was Britain's first serious entry into the field of naval aviation. She too was old, slow and poorly armed. Moreover, her aircraft carrying capacity was a mere 18. The remaining 2 carriers, Indomitable and Formidable, were powerful frontline units comparable in size to any carrier then existent. However, their design philosophy was very different. The British, whose main opponents were obviously destined to be the Germans and the Italians, had less need of long-range strike aircraft in the relatively less expansive Atlantic and Mediterranean waters. What they did need were aircraft carrying vessels that could protect convoys against air attack. This was regarded as vital to the safeguarding of the sea routes on which the British Empire ultimately depended. Essentially, these ships were of a size, speed and range similar to contemporary American and Japanese designs, but optimised to protect against air attack. As such, they carried large numbers of high-altitude, heavy anti-aircraft guns and had armoured decks capable of withstanding bomb hits without putting the ship's flight operations completely out of action. These desirable features had a price, however. Indomitable could only carry a modest 45 aircraft, and Formidable a mere 33. They and their sister ships were to prove their worth in the desperate convoy battles in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, but they were simply not designed for the classic carrier-to-carrier duel of the type that was to so characterise naval operations in the Pacific theatre. Of the smaller ships, only one of the cruisers, Dorsetshire, carried radar. All the 6-inch gun-armed light cruisers had been constructed under the emergency war plan of the First World War. Many of the destroyers were also very old, and most were also much smaller than their Japanese counterparts. The Scout class in particular were little better than destroyer escorts. But the most serious deficiency was in the quantity and quality of the aircraft deployed. The principal fighter was the Hawker Hurricane, a sturdy if somewhat stolid bomber interceptor that had in fact been the mainstay of the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain, in spite of all the attention given to the much better known Supermarine Spitfire. By April 1942, the early versions of the Hurricane were becoming obsolete, and as practically all the actual machines deployed to Ceylon were Mark 1s, it is hardly surprising that they were to find themselves easily outmanoeuvred by the Japanese Zero fighter, especially at low altitude. Serviceability was a problem too. The Hurricanes had been rushed in from the Middle East, and their engines still had desert air filters, which meant they were quite useless until tropical filters could be fitted instead. The other main fighter aircraft employed was the Ferry Fullmer, a purpose-built naval plane used on both the carriers and from Ceylon's air bases. Fulmers were durable, and like most British carrier aircraft, very versatile. However, they had no other advantages. Big, heavy and slow, they were no match for the Zero in a dogfight. The best fighter deployed was the Martlet, a British name for the American Grumman F4F Wildcat. An almost ideal carrier-borne fighter, the Wildcat was small, light and extremely easy to maintain, making it very reliable. It was also a good fighter machine, being heavily armed, very manoeuvrable and possessing an excellent range. Unfortunately, there's only one squadron of them available. The principal strike plane used was the Fairey Albacore, a 3-seat utility biplane designed as a maid-of-all work for the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm. It served as a mine layer, a torpedo bomber, a reconnaissance plane and even as a submarine hunter. It was both much slower and had far less range than either of its counterparts in the US and Japanese navies, although the main weapon, the 18-inch torpedo, was superior to contemporary American designs. Poor though the performance of the Albacore was, it still exceeded that of the other main strike plane, the Fairey Swordfish. String bags, as they were affectionately known, were the Albacor's predecessor as the main British naval bomber. They were fabric-covered biplanes which, when fully armed, had a range of only 540 miles and a top speed of only 85 miles per hour. It would be quite impossible to force either of these aircraft through contemporary Japanese carrier air defences. But the British did have one advantage. Their crews were much better trained and had far more experience in night flying. Therefore, a night attack against a Japanese force which did not have radar or night fighters might be very effective. The RAF could contribute only a single squadron of land-based level bombers. These 16 Blenheims were fair strike planes, and the aircrews were all pre-war regular Air Force. However, they had no experience in anti-shipping operations, and in any case level bombing had long since been proven to be relatively ineffective against mobile maritime targets. The only reconnaissance planes available were 7 Catalinas, for which only 6 crews could be found. The Japanese forces, under the overall command of Vice Admiral Kondo, were in stark contrast to the hurriedly scraped together British Eastern Fleet. The main carrier strike force was the famous Kido Butai, the force that had carried out the attack on Pearl Harbor, with the exception of the aircraft carrier Keiga, which had been detached to Japan for a servicing. Kido Butai was then the most powerful naval strike force in the world. Its component ships were modern and well armed. Their crews were experienced, highly trained, and had known nothing but victory. Kondo divided the ships into 2 groups. A raiding force under Vice Admiral Ozawa was ordered to sweep into the Bay of Bengal with the intention of disrupting the rich commercial traffic there. The second force, under Vice Admiral Naguma, was to cover the actions of the raiding force by launching air attacks on British bases in Ceylon, and if possible the British Eastern Fleet as well. It was well equipped to do so. Each of the 5 big aircraft carriers was equipped with 2 squadrons of Zeros, some 120 machines in total. Each also carried 2 smaller squadrons of Val dive bombers and Kate torpedo bombers, except for the larger Akagi, which carried 3 of each, making a grand total of 100 of each type. The small aircraft carrier Ryuju carried about 15 Kates and 20 of the older Claude fighters. In addition, all of the Japanese battleships and cruisers carried 1 or 2 Dave or Jake seaplanes, which were widely used for spotting purposes. The reconnaissance effort was further supplemented by long-range Mavis seaplanes operating from an advanced base at Port Blair. Overall, although the 2 sides had roughly equal numbers of ships, the Japanese force had a big tonnage advantage. They also had a big qualitative edge. Their fleet was far more modern, far more coherent, and far better suited to the new style of carrier warfare. In the air, the position was even worse for the British. Even with all of their land-based aircraft, they were still heavily outnumbered, fielding less than 250 planes against nearly 400. In addition, the Japanese aircraft were almost uniformly faster, more manoeuvrable and better armed, but their biggest advantage was in having a much longer reach. Most of the British aircraft were of very low endurance. The British also suffered from insufficient information about the capabilities and even their intentions of their opponents. They had only an approximate date for the attack and no idea at all what force the Japanese would utilise, except that it would be superior to their own. The British Admiralty decreed that it was vital that a fleet in being be retained in the Indian Ocean in order to provide any kind of security at all to the Indian subcontinent. Therefore, if all the Japanese planned was a raid, Somerville's purpose would be to keep his fleet from becoming entangled with a vastly superior force. On the other hand, if the Japanese incursion was a prelude to a full-scale invasion of Ceylon, then he would have to make the utmost effort to protect the island, even if it meant losing the entire fleet. If he had known the Japanese had decided to use their main carrier strike force, Somerville would certainly have withdrawn as quickly as possible. As it was, he was unable to because of the potential threat to Ceylon. It was a painful dilemma to be in, and Somerville had no illusions about his task. He quickly realised his only chance was an airstrike at night from his carriers, possibly in conjunction with land-based aircraft, which hopefully would weaken the enemy enough to enable successful engagement with his capital ships. It was a long shot against a wary opponent, and Somerville was fully aware that it was not likely to work. Somerville arranged for land-based air patrols to be conducted southeast of Ceylon to cover the anticipated Japanese approach path. By the night of 31st of March, the Eastern Fleet was concentrated 80 miles south of the island in an intercept position. Somerville's plan was to locate and track the Japanese fleet quickly while staying out of their air reconnaissance range until nightfall, then to steer to a launching position as fast as possible. Accordingly, flying constant patrols, the British Eastern Fleet swept different areas to the south and east of Ceylon for 3 successive nights, but failed to sight any Japanese ships. The long-range Catalina patrols from Ceylon, ordered to search to a depth of 420 miles, similarly reported no contact. Somerville's problems began to stack up. He had to consider the quite likely possibility that intelligence had been wrong about the timing of the Japanese attack, or even its very existence. Continually operating south of Ceylon was increasing the chance of detection by Japanese submarines, which were known to be operating in the area. The fleet oiler Appleleaf had replenished some of the destroyers on the 2nd of April, but other supplies were already running low, owing to a general shortage of supply ships and tankers. In addition, the ever-present demand for ships for other duties was becoming pressing. Convoys were assembling at Ceylon and would need escorts. The threat to India had prompted the War Cabinet in London to undertake the emergency countermeasure of invading Madagascar, and warships would soon be needed to both execute and cover the landings. Faced with all this, Somerville decided to abort the operation and begin reallocating ships to other duties. His decision to do so was strictly speaking premature, for it was not based on definite information. In retrospect, it may have saved the Eastern Fleet from complete disaster. The dispersal of the fleet began on the 3rd of April. Dorsetshire was detached to Colombo to resume a refit. Cornwall was similarly detached to the same port in order to escort a convoy. The destroyer Decoy had already been sent to Colombo for repairs on the 1st of April following a breakdown in her main feed pump. Hermes and the Australian destroyer Vampire were sent to Trincomalee to prepare for the Madagascar operation. The destroyer Fortune was sent to the aid of a merchant ship Glen Shiel, which had been torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. The rest of the fleet returned to the Aду Atoll. The British force was therefore very badly scattered when a Catalina detected large numbers of Japanese ships about 360 miles southeast of the southern tip of Ceylon at 1600 hours on the same day. The attack, as at Pearl Harbor, had been timed to coincide with a national holiday, in this case Easter Sunday, which was then on the 5th of April. Somerville had been caught off guard. The Eastern Fleet would need at least another 24 hours to complete fueling, and could not possibly intercept the Japanese before they could attack Ceylon. He decided therefore to concentrate his refueling efforts on the fast division alone and sailing them as quickly as possible, ordering the slow division to follow later. In the meantime, air defences at Ceylon were alerted, and all shipping capable of sailing in Colombo harbour was ordered to disperse to the westward. The cruisers Dorsetshire and Cornwall were instructed to rejoin the fleet with all dispatch, and Hermes and Vampire, which had reached Trincomalee, to hurriedly refuel. At 0800 on the 5th of April, 91 Japanese dive bombers, escorted by 36 fighters, attacked Colombo harbour and Ratmalana airstrip. The newly installed radar broke down, and though all of the defending fighters were able to take off, they were caught at low altitude by the raid's escorts. No less than 19 were shot down, and the Japanese were able to press home their attacks. Their dive bombing was very accurate, but thanks to the prudent decision to evacuate the harbour, little actual damage was done. The destroyer Tendos, which had been under repair, was sunk at her moorings, as was the armed merchant cruiser Hector. Harbour facilities were damaged, and No. 788 Squadron in transit from Trincomalee blundered into the fierce dogfights, and all 6 of its swordfish were lost. The Ceylon air defences counterattacked with their land-based bombers, but the weather had by then closed in, and the Blenheims failed to make contact. The following day found the British still desperately trying to concentrate. The weather was fair, almost dead calm with near perfect visibility, and Japanese reconnaissance planes had no difficulty in detecting Dorsetshire and Cornwall as they steamed to rejoin. At around 1340, a force of over 50 dive bombers caught up with the 2 cruisers. For some reason, radar failed to give warning of the incoming strike, but when 3 aircraft were spotted at high altitude, Dorsetshire opened fire immediately. These planes promptly dived on Cornwall. While Dorsetshire was firing on this first group, another formation of 3 attacked her. In spite of wild avoiding action to starboard, all 3 bombs hit, disabling the radios, the steering gear and most of the portside anti-aircraft guns. The Japanese continued to attack in successive formations of 3. In just 4 minutes, Dorsetshire took at least another 6 direct hits and began to list heavily to port. The order to abandon ship was given, and only 2 or 3 minutes later she capsized and sank stern first. Cornwall fared little better. She took at least another 8 direct hits and a great many near misses, which did tremendous damage underwater, including causing the engine and boiler rooms to flood. She was abandoned at 13:55 and sank bow first 5 minutes later. Throughout the 5th of April, Catalinas continued to give shadowing reports of Japanese heavy units, although 2 were intercepted and shot down. Initially, these movements seemed to indicate the Japanese were preparing to launch an air attack on Ado Atoll, and Somerville promptly changed course to keep to the south of the estimated Japanese position. The British now believed they were heading west-southwest, parallel to their opponents. It was only at 1800 hours that it was realised the Japanese had turned to the northwest about an hour previously. Somerville immediately turned Force A to the northwest as well, in order to avoid Japanese search patterns, unite his forces, and yet remain close enough to launch a night air attack. His manoeuvring was successful. The Eastern Fleet remained undetected and closed to within strike range of the Japanese by nightfall. By 19:30 until 0600 the following morning, torpedo-laden British aircraft probed northwards to a depth of 200 miles, but the only contact made was with the Slow Division, which rejoined at 0900. Somerville's forces were now united, but the exact position of the Japanese had been lost. To be caught in the open during daylight hours would be to court disaster. The Eastern Fleet would have to retreat. Still fearing an attack on Ado Atoll, Somerville resolved to keep well clear. He headed eastward, detached 3 ships to pick up survivors from Cornwall and Dorsetshire, and awaited the chance for another night attack. However, no definite reports of the position of the enemy were made. Still concerned for Ado Atoll, the Eastern Fleet cautiously took a circuitous route back to the base, flying constant all-round air searches. They arrived at 1100 on the 8th of April and immediately commenced refuelling. The Japanese, who were unaware of the secret base at the Ado Atoll, had been leisurely heading northwards. They had been disappointed by the paucity of targets at Colombo and hoped for better results at Trincomalee. A Catalina finally spotted them on the afternoon of 8th of April, and shipping in Trincomalee harbour, including Hermes, was ordered to disperse southward. At 0700 the next morning, British radar detected large numbers of enemy aircraft about 90 miles off, and 25 minutes later both level and dive bombing attacks were made against the docks and the airbase. As at Colombo, the bombing was extremely accurate. Considerable damage was done to the yards and also to the airbase, a dozen planes in various stages of assembly being destroyed on the ground. The British again riposted with their level bombers, and this time they managed to locate the Japanese fleet and swarms of defending fighters. Gritting their teeth, the British pressed home the attack, but no hits were scored. In contrast, all 9 Blenheims on the raid were badly shot up, and 5 failed to return. Subsequently, Japanese reconnaissance planes returning from patrol over Colombo detected Hermes and her escorts as they made their way back to Trincomalee. The sighting report they made was picked up and decoded by British intelligence, and fighters were swiftly ordered to cover the carrier. Unfortunately, the recent air raid at Trincomalee had badly disrupted communications, and the message and subsequent assistance was delayed. At least 85 Japanese planes smothered the Hms Hermes with more than 40 direct bomb hits in the space of only a quarter of an hour. The Japanese force then went on to sink Vampire, the corvette Hollyhock, and 2 auxiliaries. They did, however, respect the conventions of war and avoided attacking the hospital ship Vita, which was able to pick up most of the survivors. Meanwhile, Somerville had come to the correct conclusion that the Eastern Fleet was not strong enough to dispute control of the area with the Japanese. Accordingly, with the approval of the British Admiralty, he ordered the Slow Division to Kilindini in East Africa for training, while the Fast Division was to retire to Bombay. Ceylon would have to fend for itself. But the island's paltry defences were not to be tried again. On the afternoon of 9th of April, the Japanese force was spotted for the last time. They were 170 miles from Ceylon and heading south at high speed. The Indian Ocean sweep was over. Total British naval losses amounted to 1 light carrier, 2 8-inch gun heavy cruisers, 2 destroyers and several minor vessels. In addition, Ozawa's raid force had romped around the Bay of Bengal, doing tremendous damage to the merchant shipping there, and also launching air strikes on ports. All told, Japanese aircraft had sunk 15 vessels and Japanese cruisers another 8. 6 more merchants were lost to submarines either in the Bay of Bengal or on the west coast of India, for a grand total during the period of nearly 150,000 gross tonnage. Sea communications to Calcutta were badly disrupted, a particularly serious blow as the port was the main staging area for reinforcements to the Burma front. In contrast, no Japanese ships were sunk, in fact none were damaged in any way at all. Aircraft casualties are more difficult to estimate in the face of incomplete reports and conflicting propaganda. Overall, it seems likely that the assorted air operations between the 2nd and 9th of April cost the British about 40 aircraft, with another dozen partially assembled machines being lost on the ground. The Japanese probably lost about half that. Personnel casualties are also difficult to appraise accurately. Japanese losses were confined exclusively to aircrew and were therefore fairly minimal. The sinking of Dorsetshire and Cornwall claimed more than 420 lives. The sinking of Hermes, Vampire and the various auxiliaries with them over 350. Adding aircrew, merchant ship crews and victims of the bombing of Ceylon brings total British casualties to well over 1,000, almost all of them military. Firstly, the British policy of defending the Far East with large obsolete forces was once again shown to be wholly inadequate. In fact, rather than acting as a deterrent, the presence of the Eastern Fleet was a positive inducement for the Japanese to attack, in order to eliminate a potential threat. Secondly, the dominance of aircraft carriers at sea was confirmed, and no time did any of the battleships involved sight enemy warships, nor did any of them fire a single shot in anger. Thirdly, Japanese reconnaissance, largely carried out by seaplanes from their cruisers and battleships, was distinctly lacklustre. Although they located Hermes, Dorsetshire and Cornwall, not once was the main body of the Eastern Fleet spotted. Also, no attempt was made to find the large numbers of merchant vessels that had scattered from both Trincomalee and Colombo. In contrast, the Allied reconnaissance effort, spearheaded by the excellent Catalina, performed quite admirably given the limited numbers available. Fourthly, all British witnesses commented on the outstanding accuracy of Japanese dive-bombing attacks. The high quality of both their aircraft and crews was a major factor in Japan's early war successes. Fifthly, the Japanese took great care to limit attacks to military targets only. In spite, or perhaps because, of this, the morale effects on the sweep on the civilian population was considerable. Invasion scares started throughout India and they took some time to die down. Finally, the British learned from defeat. Air reinforcements to Ceylon and the Far East in general were urgently dispatched. However, apart from periodic sorties to suppress Axis light forces, there was no further naval activity in the Indian Ocean.